There's a pattern that has destroyed every major empire in history, not by conquest or revolution, but by economic collapse, specifically currency collapse. Remarkably, it unfolds the same way every single time. There's military overreach, reckless spending, money printing, and inflation, and then subsequently a loss of confidence, and finally, collapse. We saw this with Rome, we saw it with Spain, we saw it with Britain, and now all the warning signs are flashing again, but this time it's for the United States. Each empire believed it was different, a special case immune to the old rules, and every time they were proven wrong. Today, the United States is following the exact same pattern, step by step, stage by stage. The only question is whether we're near the beginning, the middle, or the end. This is the story of how empires destroy themselves through their own currencies. It's how it happened to Rome, it happened to Spain, and it happened to Britain. And it's why every warning sign suggests it's happening again today. At its peak, the Roman Empire controlled 60 million people across 3 continents. Rome's currency, the silver denarius, was the backbone of its economy and was trusted across the known world. For centuries, the denarius held its value, containing about 4.5 grams of pure silver. This sound money allowed Rome to pay its legions, build roads and aqueducts, and dominate trade. But running a growing empire is expensive. As Rome's borders expanded, the cost of defense, administration, and the lavish lifestyle of its elite began to outstrip revenues. When faced with the massive shortfalls that came along with the massive spending, Roman emperors chose the easy but destructive path. They debased their currency. The Emperor Nero, who reigned between 54 and 68 AD, was the first to significantly debase the denarius. He needed funds for his grand projects and military campaigns, so he ordered the mints to reduce the silver content from nearly 100% to about 93%, effectively adding 10% base metals, or metals that were worthless, to each coin. In practical terms, the state could now mint 11 coins from the silver that used to make 10, and subsequently they were able to pocket the difference. This was the ancient form of money printing. At first, the debasement seemed minor. A 90% silver denarius still looked and felt like the exact same coin, but it set a precedent that future emperors would accelerate. Over the next 2 centuries, one emperor after another debased the denarius even further to cover deficits and pay for the military and the ridiculous spending of the elite. By the time the 3rd century rolled around, the currency was about 50% silver. And just 50 years after that, it had plummeted to 5% or less silver per coin. In other words, a coin that was once virtually pure silver was now 95% cheap metal, merely washed with a thin veneer of silver. So within 2 centuries, the value of a silver coin was literally 1/10 or 1/20th what it was just 200 years prior. The government, of course, insisted nothing was wrong. The coins still had the exact same name, and they had the face of the emperor. But everyone knew the truth. Prices, as a result, skyrocketed. This was inflation to match the new swollen money supply. What cost 1 coin a century earlier now costs 50 or more. And confidence evaporated. Farmers refused to sell food for the worthless coins. They demanded payment in kind or in gold. Soldiers who had seen their pay become virtually worthless because nobody would accept the coins demanded that their pay be converted to actual gold or land. Tax collectors struggled to collect taxes in currency that nobody trusted. The once mighty Roman monetary economy ground to a halt. Now, it's crucial to note why this happened. It wasn't foreign invasion or natural disaster. Rome's borders in the mid-3rd century were stressed, but they were still holding. It was self-inflicted financial ruin. The Roman state wrecked its own currency to fund spending that it obviously couldn't afford, until the currency became worthless. And when the money failed, so did everything built upon it. By 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire collapsed completely. The government could no longer pay its officials. It could no longer maintain the infrastructure or supply the cities. The currency had died, and with it died the empire's economic cohesion. In the final analysis, the fall of Rome was as much a monetary collapse as a political or a military one. The pattern was established. Overspend, debase currency, trigger inflation, and chaos ensued, and the empire falls. Now, Jump forward about 1200 years to the 16th century. The Spanish Empire has become the dominant global power. After Columbus had discovered America, Spain gained control of its vast silver and gold reserves. The Spanish treasury swelled with unimaginable wealth. Spain minted this silver into coins, notably the famous piece of 8 Spanish dollar, which became the first true global currency. It was used and trusted from Europe to Asia. By the late 1500s, Spain was the richest and most powerful empire on earth, its influence spanning every inhabited continent. It seemed that limitless riches were theirs for the taking. Yet, exactly like Rome, Spain proceeded to destroy itself economically. The paradox of money is that more money doesn't make you richer if everyone has more money. Spain flooded Europe with New World silver, and prices soared in response. Historical data show a prolonged price revolution. During the 1500s, inflation averaged around 1 to 2% per year. And this was high, extremely high for that era. But unlike in Rome, the silver coins didn't become less pure. There was just vastly more of it circulating. So each coin bought less. And when money buys less, this is inflation, pure and simple. Too much money chasing the same goods makes everything more expensive. Spain's rulers thought that an endless supply of silver made them endlessly rich, but in reality they were debasing the value of the silver itself on the world market. But what they failed to realize was this was basic supply and demand. Now, with this abundance of silver, it made them feel like they were richer, which is probably why they failed to develop a productive economy at home. The wealth was easy. It was coming from colonies. It was just showing up. And this bred complacency. Instead of investing in industries, infrastructure, or education, Spain spent its money on wars, luxuries, and imports. Spanish society became disillusioned with commerce and manufacturing. Why bother when the riches were just showing up on shore? And when that silver just magically showed up, it was immediately used to buy goods from France, England, and the Netherlands, countries that were busy building industries. In effect, Spain was extracting wealth from the New World and transferring it to its European rivals in exchange for consumer goods. Is this starting to sound familiar? Just think about the US and China relationship. By the late 16th century, Spain was deindustrializing and becoming dependent on its competitors. In fact, it needed imports in order to survive. And all that spending, it also meant huge debts. The debt from imperial wars kept stacking up, but rather than reducing expenditures, they just kept borrowing and fighting more wars. And not only that, they were fighting wars against the very countries that they had enriched. In other words, they self-funded the wars against themselves. Eventually, as it always does, the math catches up. And in 1557, Spain declared bankruptcy. This was the first sovereign default of a major power in modern history, but it wouldn't be the last. Spain defaulted again in 1560, and again in 1575, and again in 1596. There were 4 defaults in just 40 years. This absolutely shattered Spain's credit and reputation. Lenders, other countries, refused to extend more credit, or they demanded insane amounts of interest. Each default made recovery harder, because Spain simply lost the ability to finance anything, including the wars it was trying to fight. The Spanish crown started resorting to more desperate measures, like issuing copper coinage and decreeing that it was worth the same as silver, which obviously it isn't. People weren't fooled. Confidence in the Spanish money evaporated. And once again, we see the familiar sequence. Massive influx of wealth, government overspending, excessive debt, currency inflation, serial defaults, loss of trust, and eventually empire decline. Just like Rome, Spain effectively printed away all of its advantages. The British Empire of the 19th and early 20th century stretched even further than Rome or Spain. At its World War I peak, Britain governed about 25% of the world's population. And get this, the sun literally never set on its territories. The British pound sterling was the global reserve currency throughout the 1800s and early 1900s. Roughly 60% of world trade was priced in pounds, and it was trusted in part because it was backed by gold. This was the classical gold standard. 1 pound sterling represented a fixed quantity of gold, giving the currency real anchor. This monetary stability underpinned Britain's century of industrial growth and imperial dominance. But maintaining a vast empire and fighting industrialized wars would prove expensive. even for Britain. World War I was Britain's first economic breaking point. In 1914, before the war, Britain's national debt was about £650 million. By the end of World War I, the debt had exploded to around $7.4 billion, more than a tenfold increase. Put another way, debt went from 30% of GDP in 1914 to about 140% of GDP by 1919. Britain borrowed massively to finance the war, selling war bonds to its citizens and borrowing abroad, especially from the United States. It also suspended the gold standard in 1914, no longer letting pounds be redeemed for gold, because it needed to print money for the war effort. After World War I, Britain attempted to restore the pre-war gold standard, but at the old exchange rate, the pound was severely overvalued. British exports became uncompetitive, economic growth stalled, and the strain on the Bank of England's gold reserves was immense. By 1931, amidst the Great Depression, Britain was forced to abandon the gold standard permanently, which, by the way, most people don't realize this, but the US was not the first to abandon the gold standard. From that point forward, the pound sterling was a fiat currency backed only by trust in the British government. And this is much like the Roman coin after its silver was gone, or the Spanish coin after devaluation. But the real collapse of the British monetary system came with World War II. Britain entered the Second World War, still weakened by the First World War and the Depression. Yet it had to spend even more furiously to fight Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. By 1945, the British public debt had ballooned to roughly 240 to 250% of GDP, an even higher debt ratio than after World War I. And the economy was in shambles. The country was essentially bankrupt despite being on the winning side. In 1944, as World War II neared its end, the Allies convened the Bretton Woods Conference to design the post-war international financial order. Recognizing Britain's weakened state, Bretton Woods replaced the pound with the US dollar as the world's primary reserve currency. The US, with its booming economy and vast gold hoard, took Britain's place. Britain tried to maintain appearances. In 1946 to 47, it received a large loan from the US and attempted to make the pound freely convertible to dollars again. But this led to a run on the pound that exhausted Britain's dollar reserves in a mere 6 weeks. In September 1949, Britain devalued the pound by 30%, from $4.03 to $2.80, openly acknowledging that the reign of the pound was over. Britain would later devalue the pound again, and each step of devaluation eroded the pound's credibility and, by extension, Britain's ability to sustain an empire. Meanwhile, one by one, Britain's colonies and dominions fell away. India gained independence in 1947. The Middle East Mandate States in the 1940s to 50s, African and Asian colonies through the 1950s to 60s, and the Suez Crisis of 1956, where the US opposed Britain's attempt to use force in Egypt, made it clear the UK could no longer act as a first-rank imperial power. By the late 1960s, the British Empire was effectively dissolved. At home, the 1970s brought stagflation and crises. Inflation hit 20 to 25% at its peak. The once mighty pound plummeted in value, and in 1976, Britain had to beg the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. The insanity of this is it was essentially the bank manager calling in the family silver. The empire's former wealth was gone. In summary, Britain's story in the 20th century followed the exact same familiar pattern. Huge war debts, followed by money printing, leading to currency devaluation and inflation. And this, of course, just like it did with Rome and Spain, caused the empire to collapse. And this proved that even the strongest empires aren't immune to the laws of economics. Now, as the saying goes, history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. As we look forward to the modern day, the United States exhibits every one of the classic warning signs we've seen in Rome, Spain, and Britain. Let's start with military overextension. The US maintains roughly 750 to 800 military bases in over 70 countries worldwide, which is more overseas military presence than any empire in history. Trillions have been spent on wars and defense commitments. This global military reach is insanely expensive, just as Rome's far-flung legions or Britain's worldwide navy were. Defense and security consume a huge portion of the budget. The US defense budget is over $800 billion per year. Like Rome and Britain, the US is paying to police the world, and it's paying with borrowed money. And speaking of borrowed money, then there's unsustainable government spending. The US has run persistent budget deficits for decades, except for a brief period around the 2000s. Trillion-dollar annual deficits have become the norm, even in peacetime and economic growth periods. Now, when you're making money, you probably shouldn't be spending more than you're making, but that's exactly what's happening. Washington keeps promising more than it collects in taxes. From massive military expenditures to generous entitlement programs, things like Social Security and Medicare, and stimulus packages. I mean, stimulus packages after stimulus packages after stimulus packages. The result is an ever-growing national debt. In 1980, the U.S. national debt was just under $1 trillion. By 2000, it was $5.6 trillion. After the 2008 financial crisis, it surged even more. After 2020's COVID crisis, it surged again. As of 2025, the U.S. federal debt has swelled to around $36 to $38 trillion, roughly 130% of America's GDP, and still climbing. Now, just think about this for a moment from the perspective of Great Britain after World War I. This is a 40-fold increase in debt in about 45 years. Just like Britain, the U.S. is effectively binge borrowing to maintain its global role and domestic programs. And guess what? Just like in Rome and Spain and Great Britain, currency debasement is happening. Money printing is real. When borrowing couldn't cover spending, the U.S. via the Federal Reserve resorted to the modern equivalent of coin debasement, the printing press. Since the 2008 financial crisis, the Fed has created literally trillions of new dollars out of thin air to buy bonds and inject money into the system. In 2020 and 2021 alone, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Fed's balance sheet expanded by roughly $4 to $5 trillion, more than doubling the monetary base. To put this in perspective, they had created more money than it had in the previous century of its existence. Policymakers claimed this would be fine, that we were in a new era exempt from old rules, kind of just like every other major power before it. But as always, when you debase a currency, inflation surges, and the US dollar is still steadily being devalued. And just like in our previous case studies, more dollars chasing the same goods makes each dollar worth less. And this leads to rising inflation and an erosion of trust. And that erosion of trust has led to a lack of global confidence in the US dollar. Foreign nations are watching. Today, countries like China, Russia, and others question the dollar's stability. Ordinary Americans are questioning it as well. They can feel that prices are rising faster than wages. This is akin to Roman officials stamping the exact same face on coins that were made out of completely different metals and saying everything is fine. But people are noticing, and there is a loss of global confidence. And this is leading some countries to consider moving away from the dollar, which is perhaps the biggest alarm bell. The US dollar is losing its absolute dominance as the world's reserve currency. Now, it's important to note, the dollar is still the world's leading currency, but the trend is clearly downward. In the year 2000, about 70% of global foreign exchange reserves were held in US dollars. Today, that share is around 58% and falling, the lowest in decades. Competitors and allies alike are exploring alternatives. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and a growing list of others, are actively seeking to reduce their reliance on the dollar. They are conducting more trade in local currencies. For example, China and Russia are transacting in their respective currencies. India is buying oil from the Middle East in rupees. In fact, by 2024, Russia reported that 90% of its trade with BRICS countries was being settled in non-dollar currencies. These countries are also developing new payment systems designed to bypass the US-controlled SWIFT system. Meanwhile, central banks globally are buying gold at the fastest pace in decades. All these moves indicate a hedging against the dollar. It's eerily reminiscent of how, after World War II, countries gradually shifted from holding pounds to holding dollars, or how in earlier times, people shifted from holding Roman coins to more stable currencies. And Middle Eastern oil producers are now becoming more open to accepting other currencies for oil that was once only traded in dollars. In short, the United States circa 2025 checks every box in the imperial collapse pattern. Military overreach and the costs that come with it, an addiction to debt that is with certainty unsustainable, money printing or currency debasement just like the previous empires before it, which is of course leading to inflation and a loss of confidence in the US currency. And this is happening both internationally and domestically. American leaders, like those of the past, insist that this time is different, that the US can get away with deficits and money creation indefinitely because of its unique status. But Rome's emperors likely thought the same. Spain, in its golden age, believed God favored them with endless silver, and Britain thought sterling would reign as good as gold forever. All were proven wrong. The economic laws of gravity caught up with them, each of them, and are poised to catch up with the US as well, unless it realizes that it isn't different and course corrects immediately. But regardless of whether it was Rome, Spain, Britain, or the US, the patterns are exactly the same. And there are signs that always happen before an empire collapses. And if you want to see what they are, make sure you watch this video right here.